He had an army of 32,000 men, and God said that's too many, and he whittled that army down to 300 men. How do you take 300 men against an entire army and defeat them with just torches, clay pots, and horns? This is the story of Gideon. Hey folks, I'm Pastor Eric Tritten from Gloria Lutheran Church in Hudson, Ohio, and this is a weekly word. And I'm glad you're with me today as we make our way through some stories from the book of Judges. And today we come to one of the most famous judges from the book, a man by the name of Gideon. Now, the story of Gideon, it begins as all the other stories of the judges begin, with the people did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then God gave them into the hands of their enemy. In this case, that enemy is the Midianites. So the Midianites were particularly cruel to the Israelites in the sense that they would just basically take everything from them. So they would the Israelites would try to grow their crops, and at harvest time, they would show up and take them all away. So animals that were around, they would just come and grab them. And so you would have the Israelites trying to hide their plants. They would try to hide any of the crops that they were able to harvest. And they would try to hide their animals in different places, which, there are a lot of ravines and such that make it a little bit more easy to hide things in a place like Israel at that time, with much less population than is there today, and no satellite imaging. So when we look at what's going on there, these people, they're running out of food, and they cry out to God. And one of the differences in Gideon's story is that before God calls up Gideon, he actually sends a prophet, an unnamed prophet. So we talked about Deborah a while back, and she was a prophetess. She's the only prophetess that's named in the book, only prophetess in the book, period. And this is the only prophet that shows up in the book. And this prophet is sent with a message, basically telling them that the reason that they're suffering all of these things is because, you have disobeyed the voice of the Lord. And even as God sends this prophet, it says that the angel of the Lord came to Gideon. Now, there's a couple things that need to be unpacked here. First of all, the word angel. Angels are, yes, they're angelic. Angels are these spiritual beings that God created. He uses them in a variety of ways, but the heart and the core of who they are and what they do, and what the word angel itself means, is messenger. And we have all kinds of messages about angels throughout the Bible. But in the Old Testament, when we hear this particular phrase, angel of the Lord, it often means something special and something unique and different, because the angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord, he appears to be actually the second person of the Trinity, the pre-incarnate Christ. And when we read through the account of Gideon talking to the angel of the Lord, there's some shift in the language back and forth between this name, angel of the Lord, and just the Lord. And by the end of the initial meeting of Gideon and the angel of the Lord, he actually accepts a sacrifice, an offering from Gideon. And Gideon realizes that there's more going on here. So the name Gideon, it's kind of a funny name. It might mean something along the lines of chopper or thresher or hacker, not in the computer kind, but like actually hacking things. And that kind of fits with some of the things that he does. When we meet Gideon, he is beating out wheat with a rod. Not the preferred way to do this, but again, they're trying to do this in secret and hiding it. He's in a wine press. We're going to find him cutting down an Asherah pole. And there are other times where we might look and say that name makes sense for what he does. And so when the angel of the Lord meets Gideon, the first thing that he says to him is, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And There's almost nothing about Gideon that says mighty man of valor. He is the youngest and the least of his family. He's there, he's in hiding, and he's pounding out this wheat and all of this. And he kind of responds kind of like, really? Mighty one of the Lord? The Lord is with me? Then why are the people of Israel, why are we oppressed by Midian if God is with us? And he says, I've heard stories about God's salvation from the past, but now he's abandoned us. And then the angel of the Lord says, I'm sending you to save Israel. He tells him, I will be with you to save Israel. And Gideon is beginning to glom on. This isn't just some guy sitting there. It's God himself coming and speaking to him. And so he begs to prepare a gift. He goes and he gets the gift. He comes back. It's a sacrificed goat and some bread, kind of like in the pattern of Abraham when the 3 men come and visit him. And the angel of the Lord tells him to take the offerings and set them on a rock. And then he touches it with his staff and it goes up in flame. And it's the first time that Gideon knows for sure this is the Lord. And God knew him, and he was going to work through him to do something to save Israel. Now, the first order of business, as far as God is concerned for Gideon, is that he's going to go home and he is going to remove the false worship of the people in his area. And he's going to do that by doing 2 things. One, there is a altar there to a god called Baal. And there is a pillar there to a goddess called Asherah. And Baal and Asherah were considered to be consorts. Baal was the male version and Asherah the female. And they would offer sacrifices to them, but they would also do these incredibly lewd dances and sexual reenactments. The idea being that those would get Baal to do the married thing with Asherah so that the land would be fertile and grow the crops. And God says, I am the one true God, and I'm a jealous God. I'm not going to share my glory with these other gods. First thing that's got to happen is they've got to go. And so Gideon goes in and he tears down the altar. He cuts down, he chops down the Asherah pole. He offers a sacrifice with the wood of the Asherah pole. And everybody is just out of their minds angry when they realize what's happened. And Gideon's dad basically comes out and says, kind of like, what's this guy done for us, this Baal guy? Maybe it's time for us to return to the Lord and see what God does through Gideon in order to save his people. Now, one of the things that's really unique about Gideon's story is that God uses a number of signs to comfort and to reassure Gideon that he actually is called for the work that God has given him to do. So even after this successful mission to take down the altar and the pole, he's always kind of questioning and doubtful in terms of God's mission for him. And so God gives him some signs, and one of them has to do with a fleece. And maybe you've heard this. We still sometimes say, I'm going to lay out a fleece, kind of this idea of seeking God's will. And God basically says, so this is what we're going to do. You're going to lay out a fleece, and either the ground will be wet with dew or the fleece will be wet with dew, but not both, which would be miraculous because it should all be wet or not. And so the first time around, he says, well, let the ground be wet and the fleece be dry. And he gets up the next morning and the ground is wet, the fleece is dry. And he says, well, that was pretty cool and all, but maybe we should do it the opposite way tomorrow so that I can be really sure. And God agrees. He says, okay. And so the next morning he gets up and the ground is dry and the fleece is sopping wet. And God gives him these signs to reassure him. In fact, before Gideon actually goes into battle against the Midianites, God says, okay, I know you're looking for a sign. Sneak into the camp, and I'm going to give you a sign in there. And he sneaks in and he overhears a conversation with a couple of the Midianites saying that they had a dream about Gideon coming and defeating them. And he leaves and he knows that God had given them into his hands. So it's really interesting to look at the way that God uses these signs in Gideon's life. And again, I keep using this phrase, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. I don't think that we're supposed to be asking for signs all over the place. God has given us a great sign already. He's given us his Son, and the cross is the sign of his love and his redemption for us. So that's where we turn our eyes. But Gideon's mission in and of itself is kind of to be a sign for Israel that God was the one who was bringing salvation to them. And it wasn't their own power. It wasn't any of the other gods that they had been tempted to worship, but it was just the Lord that was doing these things. And one of the ways that he did this, so he's going to send Gideon to fight against the Midianites. And so Gideon needs an army, and he calls for an army, and about 32,000 men show up, and they're going to fight. And God looks at the 32,000 men as they're getting ready to go, and he says, it's too many. In fact, if I have that many people there, these people are going to think that they did this on their own power and they threw off Midian because they were so mighty. So why don't you say to them, if any of you are afraid, go home. Well, who in their right mind wouldn't be afraid before you go off into battle? And he says, Gideon says, well, if you're afraid, go home. 22,000 of the 32 go home. So now he's left with 10,000, which is still a pretty good sized group. And as they're going along, God looks at them and he says, you know what, that's still too many. So let's whittle it down just a little bit more. And he does this test where they go to the river and they drink. And the people who take the water and they cup it in their hands and drink it, he says, those people can go home. The people that actually stick their face down in the water where they're actually vulnerable and you can't pay attention to what's going on around you and they're lapping up water like a dog, those are the ones I want. Well, Gideon is now left with an army of 300 men. God had taken him from 32,000, an army of 32,000, to an army of 300. Because again, this is supposed to be a sign that God is the one who is saving them. And so Gideon gets there, he gets the sign that I told you about earlier where he hears the conversation, and he takes those 300 men and he breaks them into 3 divisions at different points around the Midianite camp. And they each have a jar, they each have a torch, and they each have a horn. And at Gideon's sign, they're all to break the jars, which would make a huge noise, these kind of big clay type of jars. They're to raise their torches and they're to blow the horn. So you have 300 horns going off at the same time, and all of a sudden there's light from these 300 torches all the way around the camp. And it says that they were to cry out for the Lord and for Gideon. And so this great noise comes up, and the Midianites come out, they hear the trumpets, they see the torches, and they figure that they are under attack from the Israelite army. And it says that God threw them into confusion, and they actually started fighting each other. They were so confused by what was going on. They saw people who were armed and they're not in their uniforms, and they just start fighting for their lives. And the Midianite army basically destroys itself. And the 300 men, all they did, torches, jars, horns. They didn't actually go into combat at all. And then for 40 years, it says that the Israelites had peace. Again, pretty much as long as Gideon was alive, and then he died, and they went back into idolatry. So what do we grab from the account of Gideon? I think one of the important lessons in the story of Gideon is about human nature. Gideon is a very flawed and very fearful person, and I think that that's a temptation for us. that we always just want this reassurance from God that we're doing the right thing, rather than simply trusting in His Word. And thanks be to God that He's patient with us in that. But another part of this is that temptation is real in other parts of our lives. So every one of the judges that we've talked about, when they died, Israel went right back into worshiping other gods or some other kind of wickedness. And that's a real temptation for us too. And we should be aware of that there are things in this world that would take our trust away from God and have us put our trust in them. And we have to resist that our faith would be firmly in God, who redeems us by giving His very own Son to die to pay for our sins, raising Him from the dead, giving us everlasting life, and promising that someday Jesus is going to come back and He's going to complete this work. And we live in anticipation of that day. But we're very much tempted to just kind of live in this moment and to not look ahead, and then to live for the things of this world rather than the things of the kingdom that is to come. Another thing to grab from this is that God chooses unlikely servants. Gideon is the least in his house, and yet God chooses him and He saves Israel through him. And if we look at ourselves, I think sometimes when we're honest with ourselves, we might think that we are the least likely person that God would call to serve Him, to share our hope in Jesus with somebody else, whatever it is. And it's really not about us being equipped or powerful or any of that. It's about who God is. There's a saying that God does not call the qualified, but He qualifies the called. And I think that there's something good about that He doesn't look at us and say, well, let me check out your resume, and I think that, yeah, you're the kind of person I want. He looks and He says, yeah, you don't have a resume, and yet I want you, and I'm going to give you the gifts of faith, and I'm going to sanctify your life, and I'm going to do the work to call you and to form you to be the person that I intend for you to be. And part of the reason that He does this is because ultimately what Gideon learned was that the victory belongs to God. And that's something that we need to be certain of too. That God's the one that gives us the victory. We don't go out and grab it. We don't go out and figure these things out for ourselves. God wins the victory through Christ's death and resurrection. He's the one who creates faith in us through the working of the Word and the baptism in our lives to convert us. He's the one who delivers forgiveness into our lives, whether it's as we hear those words of absolution or whether it's receiving Jesus' body and blood and forgiveness. It's really about what He's doing. And the stuff that we do, it's all downstream from there. It's all based on what He's already done for us to give us salvation. And that's important, that we would live in a right relationship with Him, trusting in Him as our Savior, the way that Gideon did. So, I hope this has been helpful to you. We're going to make a little bit of a shift next week. We're not going to talk about judges, but we're going to look in a story that takes place during the time of the judges. If this was helpful to you, please like it, share it, help other people to find it, subscribe, and come back next week, because I'm going to start talking about a woman named Ruth.